Welcome to Lesson 5, API Deployment. Let's look at how we can implement our fruit classifier in an application for the real world. We're going to have to consider a few things. First is the end user. Here we have Betty. She's at home with her computer. Second, imagine that we're deploying a web-based application, so we're going to need a web server. The web server is going to provide the web page for Betty. Our third and final component is the API endpoint. For us, we're leveraging Microsoft Azure to host our custom vision API. This includes a REST API component as well as our fruit classifier model that are going to talk to each other. Imagine now that Betty, at home, she wants to test her new fruit classifier model. So she's going to say, provide an image of an orange, upload that to the web server. The web server is then going to make a REST API call. In this case, could be a post request. Microsoft Azure endpoint is then going to receive this and process it inside of the fruit classifier, sending the image for analysis. The model that we developed in the previous lesson then informs the REST API that this is in fact an orange, and this text is transferred back in JSON format to our web server. Our web server then updates the web page that Betty is looking at to show orange. This represents the end-to-end flow for an API deployment, from Betty providing the photo of the orange, having the web server make a request to the endpoint to analyze it, the fruit classifier model analyzing the image, looking at the colors, the patterns that it's learned, and responding back with a text orange. That text is then relayed through the REST API to the web server and ultimately displayed on Betty's home computer. That summarizes a high-level end-to-end deployment. The remaining parts of this video will involve digging deeper into the web server and the API endpoint. We recommend that you look at our documentation that accompanies this video for more details. Now, let's take a closer look at the web server component. Our web server is deployed on Microsoft Azure, and it's using Python and Flask to host the web server. In addition, the endpoint is also hosted on Azure, running cognitive services, as we've covered in previous videos. Let's take a deep dive into the web server component and see how it's able to call the API. And also, we will look at the endpoint API and see how to use that. Imagine now we're Betty and we're at our computer screen and we're going to use our fruit classifier. First, we're going to go to Richardson fooddemo.azurewebsites.net. Our web page loads. We can see that this is our food classifier demo. And it's a very simple website. Let's try clicking on choosing the file that we want to send. Let's start by sending the picture of a golden apple. This looks like a nice one. Next, let's click on Classify and see what happens. Excellent. Now I can see that after pushing the Classify button, we have a recognition outcome. And this is recognizing this as a Granny Smith apple. And secondly, a apple golden 2. So not perfect results, but we can see that it is getting pretty close. and our fruit classifier is able to distinguish different types of apples. Let's try another one. To do that, I'm just going to reload the page. And start over. Let's select a file. Why don't we select a nice Braeburn apple this time? Ooh, these are nice and red. There we go. That's a tasty one. And we'll click on classify. Let's see what our recognition algorithm comes back. 100% apple Braeburn. These are great results from our API. But how is this working? Why don't we dig into the code and see what's going on underneath the hood? Let's dive into the web server code to see if we can understand what's going on. This is the Python code for our Flask web server. There's a lot of details here, and we encourage you to refer to the attached documentation for further clarification. I'm going to try to walk us through what's going on here. I want to start by looking at this function here on row 42, which is the classify function. And this is processing an HTML route with a post method for classify. Our web page is sending a post request to the web server, and this function is going to parse it. Most importantly, we can see that it's pulling out the image data here in row 48. That image data is what we want to send to our machine learning algorithm that's hosted on the Azure. We're going to use the REST API endpoint to do that. I'm now going to scroll down to row 61, 62, and 63. And we can see here there is a post request that is going to this URL, headers, parameters with this image data. Let's scroll back up. Excellent. Now, let's see if we can understand where some of those key fields in our request are coming from. Underscore URL is our endpoint. So here we can see it's our cognitive services, azure.com, custom vision, as we talked about, prediction, our key, classify, and let me scroll over and take a look. Iterations, iteration 2, image. So this is telling us where the API endpoint is. Let's look at the headers. Headers, content type, JSON. Basically, this is just some basic information required for the REST API, and it's pretty standard for all HTML. Next, let's take a look at the parameters. Here, we're just specifying that the application is a classify model. And finally, the image data that we identified before, which is coming from the post request from Betty. Next, let's see what happens when we get the response back from our API endpoint. Once the API analyzes it, we get this row 69 here, which says analysis equals response.json. At this point, we have the text reply. This text reply is in JSON format, and we'll scroll down to row 86 and 87 where we process it. So we can see that we are pulling out the predictions value from the JSON object and displaying it on the screen. And this is where we would get our text. Okay, so that concludes our review of the web server code. Next, let's dive into the API endpoint to see if we can figure out how to access it. Let's see what information we need to call our API from our web service. To do that, we're going to have to go into our cognitive application, Richardson 123, that we created in the previous videos. I'm going to dive into the custom vision portal where we have our model. There it is, the fruit classifier that we trained before. Let's go in there and see. Excellent. Next, we want to go and get the API information. And to find that, it's a little tricky. We just got to remember it's under performance. So I click on performance. Here I am. Now we can see that there's prediction URL here at the top. However, it's grayed out. The reason is to make our API endpoint accessible, we need to publish it. So let's go ahead and do that. Excellent. I'm going to publish my model, iteration number 2. I trained it a few times. And let's choose our resource, and we're going to use our free trial resource, Richardson 123. And I'm going to go ahead and publish that. Excellent. Now I can see that the prediction URL is no longer grayed out. Let's go ahead and click on that. And here are some instructions, how to use the prediction API. Excellent. From here, I can grab the information that I need. This is the URL that we are going to find inside of our web server. As well, we can see the header key, prediction key, content type, and the body, how to call the image. Excellent. So that summarizes all the information required to access the API from our code. Perfect. We're now done with our deep dive into the various components in the API deployment. Again, we're going to encourage you to look at the documentation accompanying the video to get a better understanding. For now, I'd like to congratulate you for completing the fruit classifier tutorial. You learned today how to build an image classification using Azure's Cognitive Services Custom Vision API. We started by learning a little bit about the Azure platform and the components that are necessary for our project. Second, we set up our Azure and got it going. Third, we trained our model. Then we evaluated the performance of it. And finally, we looked at how we could deploy it in the real world. You're now ready to go out and try this on your own. I'd encourage you to go ahead and develop your own custom vision API for your business application. Thank you.